Lebanon, the land of the cedars and white mountains. A cultural melting pot on the east end of the Mediterranean Sea. Around 4.5 million Lebanese are living in the country that is only as big as the Caribbean island Jamaica. More than 80% of the people accumulate in the urban regions. For many years, this small country enjoyed international respect for its multiculturalism. But this has also been a trouble spot. Lebanon's religious diversity in particular has led to harsh conflicts in its history. When the Syrian crisis started in 2011, it also had a huge effect on Lebanon. It is estimated that between 1 and 1.5 million Syrians have fled to the neighboring country.
Well, Lebanon has been struggling with so many challenges for decades. Ever since the end of the civil war, there are so many problems related to sectarianism, related to racism, classism, in addition to electricity crises, water crisis, garbage crisis. All of these things, they have been a thing for long before the war in Syria. And what happened when Syrian refugees arrived here, the Lebanese government had a scapegoat. They have someone who they can blame for everything that's going wrong in this country, even though the main thing to blame is the system in this country, these classical leaders that have been in control of their parties and of their people.
Lebanese media is widely connected to politicians. A close investigation by the Media Ownership Monitor shows that their parties and families own most media outlets.
Lebanese media are always projecting frames or representations of Syrian refugees as negative to Lebanese society. And this mainly comes from one of our main politicians in the country who is a member of the parliament and is also the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is very critical of Syrian presence in Lebanon and is also extreme in his views of how they are bad in terms of economy.
So politicians abuse the refugees and the coverage of the refugees to their own interests, their own political interests. The Lebanese Free Patriotic Movement and media outlets that support the Future movement tend to frame refugees in a way that they are coming and taking the jobs of the Lebanese people. Media that are more in line with Hezbollah, for example, or another political group tends to be a lot more sympathetic with the refugees, showing them actually being very weak, helpless, wanting to go back to their country.
Syrian refugees are highly instrumentalized by Lebanese media and political parties. Their decisions and framing are broadening the gap between refugees and the Lebanese society.
If you acquire a residency permit, Syrians are only allowed to work in 3 sectors: as farmers, as cleaners, and as construction workers. So even if I had a residency permit, you are not allowed to work as a journalist or as a doctor or as an engineer, because this is reserved for the Lebanese or foreigners of another sort.
In Lebanon, as a Lebanese person, as someone who hears about all of this, we tend to always look at Syrian refugees and package them and frame Syrian refugees as those bad people who are doing all of these bad things to the country. And I've noticed this personally when I go to cafes around Beirut and I sit somewhere, I hear a lot of the Syrian accent, and I look around to look, and they are a bunch of university students doing university work. For me, oh, those look like most people. But then we look at others who might actually be Lebanese beggars on the streets, but we also say, or most of the discourse is that those are the Syrian refugees. So there's always the negative look on this.
Then they talk to you and say, oh, you could just be Lebanese, which they may mean as a compliment, but of course is very problematic as well. It means that their perception of a Syrian is just a refugee who hasn't had any opportunity to education or a decent job opportunity there.
Even if you are using the image of a Syrian refugee in a good way, you are still using that person and telling people Syrian refugee in Lebanon equals to someone who is poor and begging on the streets, and this is the problem.
The rise of social media has created a public sphere widely used as an information source to counter the orchestrated news spread by politicians and biased media outlets.
You could get your opinion heard, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will get anywhere. But at least for me, social media are positive because they do allow us, they give us a tool, a platform to speak. In the past, we did not have that.
A hashtag against hate speech. While the demonstration, I'm one of the organizers. We are a group of people who are doing with, for example, with the Islam Fares Institute, with the EUB, a lot of stories to just calm down and to tell people the refugees are victims of this war. So they're not here, they're not happy to be in the tent, they're not happy to live in unsafe areas, they're not happy to live in a very poor area. This is my opinion now, and most of the opinion, but we don't have real demonstration about peace with refugees. We don't have this.
If you check in general, I think news against Syrian refugees are spreading much faster than news pro-Syrian refugees, even on social media. Most of the Syrians I speak to, they do appreciate what Lebanon has done to them in the past 8 years. But many people I've asked them this question, they said, it's not our place, it's not our country, we're guests here. We're not allowed to, for example, demonstrate or organize strikes. Or there were some attempts, all of them was, or most of them were run by people who are unknown, and many Syrian refugees actually called these campaigns out and said these campaigns do not represent us. We're just going to stay here and mind our business rather than cause further trouble in this country.
In the case of Syrian refugees, social media movements remain few. Journalists, however, do not seem to be able to give fact-based, objective information, so such initiatives are desperately needed. Gladly, some media productions are trying to reframe Syrian refugees. For example, the widely recognized independent short film Maram.
We created a documentary called Maram, which is about a young refugee Syrian girl who sells flowers on the streets. We created this documentary with the intention of humanizing this young lady instead of dehumanizing her or getting people to pity her, which is what most videos done in this fashion usually are about. Our objective was to understand who this person is, what her aspirations in life are, what are her dreams, what is she like as a human being. This documentary went around the world, maybe 30 festivals so far.
The short film won several international prizes and, more importantly, helped change the Syrian girl's precarious situation. In Lebanon, refugees generally remain outsiders, unable to enjoy the full rights of regular citizens in their host country. All too often, they have limited opportunities for social and economic development. Meanwhile, the ongoing conflict in Syria leaves little hope for those wishing to return home anytime soon.